Adventure Ledger presents Shadows in the Sun, Episode 5. Oliver's mind raced as he handed the information to Mateo. His heart pounded in his chest, every beat a reminder of the decision he had just made. He had betrayed Marco, the very man who had kept him alive, the one who had warned him never to trust anyone. Now Oliver was the one crossing him. As Mateo tucked the note away, his eyes lingered on Oliver, sharp and calculating. "You did the right thing," Mateo said quietly, but his tone carried the weight of a warning. "But you'd better be ready. Marco's not someone who lets things like this slide." Oliver nodded, his throat dry. "I know," he managed to say, though the truth was he had no idea what he had just set into motion. He watched as Mateo turned and walked back toward Cruz's men, the weight of his choice bearing down on him like a leaden cloud. There was no turning back now. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The prison yard, chaotic and full of life only hours ago, now felt like a battlefield. He could almost hear the ticking of the clock, counting down the seconds until everything exploded. Marco was smart. He would know something was wrong soon, if he didn't already. As Oliver made his way back toward the shadows of the yard, he felt eyes following him, scrutinizing him. Were they Marco's men? Had they seen him talking to Mateo? The paranoia was setting in fast, wrapping around him like a vice. Every step felt like a gamble. Every glance could be a threat. He reached his cell, closing the door behind him as if it could somehow protect him from the consequences of his actions. The small, cramped space offered little comfort. His thoughts swirled, each one darker than the last. Had he just signed his own death warrant? Sitting on the edge of the bed, Oliver buried his head in his hands, trying to steady his breathing. What had he become? The man who had arrived in Bolivia searching for adventure seemed like a distant memory. He had been naive then, trusting, full of hope. Now that part of him was gone, swallowed by the darkness of San Sebastián. He leaned back against the cold wall, the realization sinking in. He couldn't trust anyone. Not Marco, not Cruz's men, not even himself. He had made his move, but the consequences were still waiting to unfold. And when they did, there would be no escape from the fallout. As the prison fell into its nightly routine, Oliver tried to prepare himself for what was coming. But deep down, he knew there was no way to prepare for this. Morning came far too soon, dragging Oliver back into the harsh reality of prison life. The shadows from the night before still clung to him, the weight of his betrayal pressing harder with each passing hour. As he stepped into the yard, he could feel the tension in the air. Prisoners milled about, but there was a noticeable shift in the way they moved, more cautious, more on edge. He spotted Mateo with a group of Cruz's men near the far wall, exchanging quiet words. When Mateo caught Oliver's eye, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Oliver's stomach twisted. The pact had been made, and now it was out of his hands. Still, he couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. What if Mateo told Cruz everything? What if Marco already knew? Oliver scanned the yard, looking for any sign of Marco's men, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual tension, the unspoken threat of violence always lurking beneath the surface. As he crossed the yard, Oliver was startled by a hand gripping his shoulder. He turned sharply, heart leaping into his throat. Raul stood behind him, his face a mask of cold indifference. "Walk with me," Raul said, his voice low but commanding. Oliver nodded, falling into step beside him. The two men moved through the yard in silence, winding their way toward the back of the prison, where the walls cast deep shadows over the cracked pavement. When they were out of earshot of the other prisoners, Raul stopped, turning to face Oliver. "We're making our move soon," Raul said quietly, his gaze locking onto Oliver's. "The information you gave us about Marco's plan with Cruz's supplier, it's good, but we need more. We need to know when Marco plans to strike. You can get that for us, can't you?" Oliver's pulse quickened. More information? He was already teetering on the edge of disaster, and now they were asking for even more. He didn't have a choice, though, not if he wanted to stay alive. "I'll try," Oliver replied, his voice betraying the fear gnawing at his insides. Raul studied him for a moment, as if weighing his worth. "Good, don't take too long, and don't screw this up." With that, Raul turned and disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Oliver standing alone in the shadows. The weight of their demands hung heavy over him. He had already betrayed Marco once, and now he was expected to do it again. How long could he keep this up? The day dragged on, each hour more suffocating than the last. Oliver moved through the prison like a man walking on a tightrope, every step threatening to send him plummeting into the abyss below. He knew what was at stake, and the walls felt like they were closing in on him. The paranoia, the fear, it was all consuming. He spent most of the day avoiding contact with anyone, keeping to the edges of the yard, staying out of sight. He didn't dare seek out Marco, not yet, but he knew he had to, and soon. Raul's demand for more information wasn't going away, and the clock was ticking. Finally, as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, Oliver spotted Marco near the prison's edge, talking with a few of his trusted men. This was his chance. He swallowed the knot of fear in his throat and approached. Marco saw him coming and dismissed the others, his dark eyes narrowing as Oliver neared. "Oliver," Marco said, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. "You've been keeping your distance lately." Oliver forced a small smile, his mind racing for a way to spin his next move. "Just trying to stay out of trouble," he said. "Things have been tense since the riot." Marco studied him, his gaze sharp, searching for any sign of betrayal. "Tense, yes, and dangerous. But you know that already, don't you?" Oliver's heart skipped a beat. Did Marco know? Or was this just another one of his mind games? He couldn't tell. He had to be careful. "I've heard things," Oliver said, lowering his voice. "About Cruz's men. They're planning something." Marco's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of interest in his eyes. "And what exactly have you heard?" Oliver hesitated for a split second before answering. "They're going to hit you soon. They know about the supply line." Marco's face darkened, but his voice remained calm. "Interesting. And how do you know this?" "I've been keeping my ears open," Oliver lied. "I figured you'd want to know." Marco nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Oliver's face. "Good. You've done well, Oliver, but don't get comfortable. We're just getting started." As Marco turned away, Oliver felt the weight of the lie pressing down on him. He had given Marco just enough to keep his trust for now. But how much longer could he keep up this charade? The following days passed in a haze of tension and dread. Oliver moved between Marco and Raul like a puppet, carefully feeding both sides just enough information to keep himself alive. He could feel the noose tightening around his neck, but he couldn't stop. He was in too deep now, and there was no way out. Every conversation, every glance, felt loaded with danger. Marco's eyes were always on him, searching for any sign of treachery, while Cruz's men watched from the shadows, waiting for him to deliver on his promises. Oliver's paranoia grew with each passing day, but he kept moving, kept playing the game, because the alternative, being exposed, was unthinkable. One afternoon, as Oliver sat alone in the yard, a familiar voice broke his thoughts. Luis Torres. He hadn't seen Luis in days, but now there he was, walking toward him with that same easy smile. "Oliver," Luis said, sitting down beside him, "you look like a man under a lot of pressure." Oliver's skin crawled at the sound of his voice. Luis, the man who had started all of this, the man who had ruined his life, now seemed to take pleasure in his misery. "I didn't ask for this," Oliver muttered, not looking at him. "No, you didn't," Luis agreed, his tone light. "But here you are, right in the middle of it all." Oliver clenched his fists, trying to keep his anger in check. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now. "What do you want?" Luis chuckled softly, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "I just thought I'd remind you how things work in here. You see, Oliver, people like Marco and Cruz, they're just pieces on the board. You and me, we're playing a much bigger game." Oliver's heart pounded in his chest. He knew Luis was involved in something larger, but hearing it laid out so plainly only deepened his fear. "What do you mean?" Luis leaned closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. "Let's just say, your little game between Marco and Cruz. It doesn't matter in the end. There are bigger forces at work, and soon, none of this will even matter." With that, Luis stood and walked away, leaving Oliver sitting in the yard, his thoughts racing. If Luis was right, then nothing he did here would save him. The game was rigged from the start. The revelation from Luis left Oliver reeling. If what he said was true, then Oliver's struggles in the prison were part of something much larger, something beyond his control. But the immediate threat of Marco and Cruz still loomed over him, and no cryptic warning from Luis could change that. He was still trapped in their web, and he needed to focus on staying alive. Later that evening, Oliver found himself in his cell, staring at the cracks in the wall, trying to piece together his next move. He had given Raul the information about Marco's plan, and he had managed to convince Marco that he was still loyal. But how long could he keep walking this tightrope? Soon, one side would come for him. As if on cue, there was a knock at his cell door. Oliver's heart jumped into his throat as the door creaked open, revealing Raul standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "We're ready to make our move," Raul said, his voice low but firm. "Marco's vulnerable now. He thinks he's got the upper hand, but we're going to hit him hard, and we need you." Oliver's stomach twisted. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. Cruz's men were finally making their play, and they were counting on him to deliver the final blow. If he went through with it, there would be no turning back. "What do you need me to do?" Oliver asked, his voice steady despite the panic rising inside him. Raul stepped into the cell, closing the door behind him. "Marco's planning something big. We've heard whispers, but we need confirmation. You're close to him. You'll find out what he's planning, and you'll signal us when the time is right." Oliver's heart raced. If he did this, if he betrayed Marco completely, there was no going back. But if he refused, Raul and Cruz's men would turn on him, and Marco would find out soon enough. Either way, he was caught in the middle of a storm he couldn't escape. "Fine," Oliver said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll do it." Raul nodded, satisfied. "Good. Don't let us down, Oliver. This is your last chance." As Raul left, Oliver sat on his bed, the weight of his decision crashing down on him. He had just agreed to betray Marco fully, but the doubt gnawed at him. Could he pull it off? The next day passed in a blur of tension and fear. Oliver moved through the prison like a ghost, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. He had agreed to help Cruz's men, but the stakes had never been higher. Marco was watching him closely, and every word, every move he made felt like a potential death sentence. By the time evening rolled around, Oliver knew he couldn't delay any longer. He had to get close to Marco, had to find out what his next move was. But as he approached Marco in the yard, his hands trembling slightly, the enormity of what he was about to do hit him like a wave. Marco was talking with a group of prisoners near the far wall, his voice low, calm as always. When he saw Oliver approach, he dismissed the others, turning his attention to him. "Oliver," Marco said, his tone almost friendly, "you've been quiet lately." Oliver forced a smile, trying to keep the fear from showing. "Just been thinking about everything. You know, staying alive." Marco nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Smart. In a place like this, survival is the only thing that matters." Oliver hesitated, the words caught in his throat. He had to play this perfectly, or everything would fall apart. "I've been hearing things," Oliver said slowly, "about Cruz's men. They're planning something, but they don't trust me enough to let me in completely." Marco's expression darkened, but he said nothing, waiting for Oliver to continue. "I need to get closer to them," Oliver added, his heart racing. "If I do, I can find out exactly what they're planning and stop them before they make their move." For a long moment, Marco said nothing, his eyes locked onto Oliver's. Then finally, he smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down Oliver's spine. "Good. Do what you have to do. But remember, Oliver, if you betray me, I'll know, and there won't be anywhere you can hide." As Oliver walked away, the reality of his situation sank in deeper than ever. He had played both sides for too long, and now the endgame was approaching. He was on the edge of betrayal, and no matter which side he chose, someone would come for him.
This is the end of the episode. Thank you for listening. If you like the story, please subscribe to our channel and check out our other stories. You can find the link to the next episode in the description below. What do you think about this episode? Let us know in the comment section below.